Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to learn about the intimate partner violence intervention and its very innovative approach. You can't? Okay. Just get a lot closer. Okay. I'm hugging the mic. All right. All right. Good morning. All right. I'm so excited that there are so many people that want to learn about intimate partner violence first thing in the morning on a Friday. So thank you. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about the intimate partner violence intervention. It uses the national network's principles that have informed really effective interventions against homicide, gun violence, drug markets, and other critical public safety problems, and applies it to intimate partner violence. As someone who's worked in this field for most of my career, I'm very excited to be here, to be part of the national network, and to be here with these really incredible women that have been working in this field and talking today about an innovation around the criminal justice system's responses to intimate partner violence. So criminal justice strategies, as we all know, have played a prominent role in how we think about intimate partner violence. And those responses have often signaled a social commitment to taking it seriously. And they've aimed to break the cycle. They've aimed to ensure that abusers receive treatment and that victims stay safe. But they haven't always been able to make inroads in controlling abusers or stopping their behavior. IPVI, as we call it, takes an offender-focused approach to keeping victims safe. IPVI aims to identify and deter the most serious intimate partner violence offenders, reduce intimate partner violence, and reduce harm to victims. It challenges us to question our assumptions about intimate partner violence offending and the capacity of law enforcement to reduce it. Well, before I introduce our panelists, just a few linguistic housekeeping options. Oh, hi. Is that for me? Thank you. Right. So just some linguistic matters. We're talking about intimate partner violence, which many of us know as domestic violence. We often use them interchangeably. I might slip and use them interchangeably, but we talk about it as intimate partner violence because we're not talking about that broad spectrum of family violence. We're talking very specifically about violence that occurs between current or former intimate partners. I will use acronyms. I might say IPV instead of intimate partner violence. And I might say DV when I slip up and refer to intimate partner violence as domestic violence. Just old habits die hard. I'm also going to be relatively heteronormative by default, talking about he and she, recognizing that victims and offenders can be men, women, or gender nonconforming. But predominantly, the research shows us that more women are victims and more men are offenders. Glad someone else said it. And I also want to point out a few things about this intervention. And we're gonna get into what makes it so interesting, what makes it so special, and why it's so innovative. And a couple of things to think about for those of you that have done any work in the criminal justice system around intimate partner violence, working with victims, working with offenders. This is an approach that's seeking to control and deter offenders. It uses clear, direct communication from law enforcement, just like we talk about in our group violence work or our drug market work. It recognizes that not all offenders are the same, just like we know not all victims are the same, and that we have opportunities to actually intervene early and prevent and deter future violence. We do what we can through this intervention to address what we talk about in the criminal justice field as the experiential effect, which is what we learn from a system based on how a system responds to things. We want to take the burden off victims. We want to establish the state and not the victim as being responsible for addressing violence. We want to mobilize the community around this. As we've talked about over the past day and a half, public safety involves our communities. And we want to ensure that victim safety is at the heart of this. And the development of this intervention isn't something that happened overnight. It was a collaboration between, honestly, our innovative partners in High Point, North Carolina, including the High Point Police Department. Chief is here today. The Guilford County District Attorney's Office, the High Point Community Against Violence, Family Services of the Piedmont, as well as researchers at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, Deputy Commissioner Susan Herman, and the National Network. And before I introduce everyone, I do want to single out the leadership and vision of the High Point Police Department, who has been innovating in their focused and dedicated approaches to policing, and who have boldly and I think quite successfully piloted this work. And most recently, in October, were awarded the Herman Goldstein Award for problem-oriented policing, which for those of you in law enforcement, it's kind of a big deal. All right. The dresses are better. Great. So I'd like to introduce to you our panel, Deputy Commissioner Susan Herman with the New York Police Department, Shay Harger, Director of the Victim Services Division, Family Service of the Piedmont, and Sandy Tibbetts-Murphy, Legal Policy Advisor of the Battered Women's Justice Project. We're going to start our conversation with Susan, because you have spent much of your career working with victims of intimate partner violence, advocating for victims of all crime, seeking to improve the criminal justice system and empower communities, and have a bird's eye view to how all of this came to be. Can you share a little bit with us about how law enforcement's response to IPV has changed and what led you to be a part of this?
Absolutely. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's still morning. It's good to see you, sort of, in the dark, mellow room. I'm just going to say a few things at the outset. I'm probably going to say DV. It's just because it's shorter than IPV, but I am also talking about IPV. This is an IPV intervention. And I worked as a full-time victim advocate really before I went to the police department, the first time back in the mid-'80s, in between after I left the police department, and now I'm back, very privileged to be doing my second tour of duty in the NYPD. But it is true, I have spent most of my professional life working on behalf of victims and helping victims in the aftermath of crime. For several years, I managed a large division here in New York at a social service agency, then called Victim Services, now Safe Horizon, and I ran all the programs for battered women and children, and I worked on the national policy level as the executive director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And I'm going to start by telling a story that some of you have heard, because I think David loves telling this story, but I love repeating it too. When I was the executive director at the National Center, David and I were at a meeting together in Washington with lots of victim advocates, and we were gathered together by a prominent foundation that was asking the question, where should they put their money in terms of domestic violence? What a great question to give to people who live on soft money, right? So where should we put our money? What should we do? And David talked about research that he had conducted that showed that chronic batterers, not people who are sort of one-off here and maybe a few years later there's another incident, but chronic batterers tended to be people who were involved in other forms of criminal behavior. And he proposed an initiative adapting his focused deterrence work to domestic violence. He said, essentially, let's do what we do with ceasefire. Let's identify a small group of people who are responsible for the most violence, and let's have call-ins. Let's tell them the violence needs to stop, and let's make genuine offers of assistance, and let's promise real consequences if the violence continues. So let's design a strategy that tries to stop his violence and take the burden off her. Let's actually make it about his behavior, not just her courage. So first there was silence in the room, and I mean real silence. And then a lot of people started talking at once about how bad this idea was. Real bad idea. But I actually loved it right away. And at that point, I'd been in the field for a long time, and speaking frankly, I thought our field was stuck. And there had been no new, really big, new breakthrough ideas in a long time. We were, among other things, we had been and continued to be, to some extent, I thought, and when I say we, then I meant both victim services and law enforcement. We were operating out of fear. Fear that anything that we did would make the violence worse or would set off the batterer. So for years, we didn't contact victims by phone or letters because it might make the batterer angry. And we didn't do home visits because it might make the batterer angry. And then we realized that anything could serve as an excuse for the batterer, and we started to contact victims through letters and phone calls and home visits. And as a result, victims were accessing victim services and police services much sooner. So to me, we needed another breakthrough, and the focused deterrence approach seemed to fit the bill. I looked at the police response, and it had gone basically from walking batterers around the block to cool off, to mediating domestic disputes, to ignoring them, and finally, after several lawsuits and lots of federal money, to policies mandating arrest. And too many of those arrests led to both parties getting arrested and nobody getting relief. So women went from being under-policed and under-protected to over-policed and under-protected. On the advocate side of the equation, over the last 35 years, then, not now, strategies concentrated in 3 areas. And I'm talking more than 10 years ago at this point that we had this meeting, probably 15 years ago. But on the advocacy side, we concentrated in 3 areas. Public awareness campaigns to convince the public that domestic violence is a crime, or at least that it's something that women don't have to live with. New resources and services for battered women, from crisis response to addressing long-term needs, and a few programs for batterers that try to explain what power and control is all about. It's not till recently that these programs are incorporating CBT into their work. And the third area was significant efforts to try to coordinate community responses. That was sort of the theme of the day. Let's get law enforcement, healthcare, and social services to talk to each other. Very hard for disciplines who don't play together to have money dangled in front of them and say, you'll get this money only if you play together, and then suddenly they're telling you how they're going to play together. They didn't come from organic strategies that all sides agreed with. So many advocates, though, and this is really my role on this panel, I'm here to tell you why there was resistance, why in some quarters there continues to be, but how that resistance is going away. Many advocates who heard about the focused deterrence strategy worried again that it would expose victims to more violence and make them more hesitant to access services and feel even more powerless. Exactly what advocates don't want. So some predicted that there would be significant problems when we adapted strategies that were designed to combat gun violence and open-air drug markets to DV. For example, unlike open-air drug markets or gang violence, DV, and particularly IPV, involves identified victims, specific people, men who batter target one woman over and over, and so targeting a batterer, unlike a gang member, could put a specific known person at risk. As he feels outed by the kind of direct communication that we talk about in this strategy and is given credible warnings about real consequences, he may become more violent towards her. That's what the feeling was. And how would you ever really know if the violence stopped or she was just too scared to tell anyone that it continued? Some advocates believe that focused deterrence strategies would not sufficiently respect victims' fears and desires. We know that victims choose not to report for lots of reasons. Some fear more violence or don't want to risk losing his emotional or financial support. Many women don't report because they don't want the batterer to be subjected to the abuses of the criminal justice system. Many victims want to continue their relationship with the perpetrator, and lots of people, including many victims and perpetrators, view domestic violence as a private issue. So there are lots of reasons people don't report. And despite much research to the contrary, at this point, many advocates also believed that most batterers do not use violence in other aspects of their lives. That's how we talked about it. We said they don't hit their boss when they get angry at work, and they don't hit the waiter when the waiter comes and the soup is cold. They don't hit the waiter. They don't have these outbursts there, and they're not necessarily involved in other crime. So what leverage would we have on them? It's leverage that's really important in these focused deterrence strategies. How could you influence their behavior as you could with gang members or drug dealers? Here's another reason. I'm just going to give you all the reasons everybody thought bad idea, but I am going to turn it around. Trust me. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep asking me back to do this, right? Most advocates hold dear a particular bedrock principle in their work. Do what you can to maximize options and make sure women have the power to choose their own path forward. Bedrock principle in victim services and advocacy. So some feared that this strategy would take more power away from a woman who already feels powerless. The decision about whether to involve the criminal justice process or whether a prosecution would move forward would no longer be hers to make. Bad idea, it sounds like. Finally, while many advocates have worked hard to convince the public that domestic violence is a crime and offenders should be sanctioned, others believed that it's best addressed through education to prevent abusive relationships and services to allow women to leave abusive relationships and move on with their lives. On some level, if you believe that changing our culture, a culture that supports violence against women in so many ways, and you have to believe that, then you kind of get to a place where you say the ultimate solution to DV, really anything with a real enforcement emphasis can be seen as irrelevant as best and potentially harmful at worst. We got to change the culture. It's not about enforcement. So given all these reasons, and I'm a pretty good advocate so I can make a case for the other side, given all these reasons why this is a bad idea, you shouldn't be applying focused deterrence to DV, why did I want to participate in this project? So here's where I came down. First, I believe strongly that our society as a whole has an interest in victim safety and an obligation not only to help victims rebuild their lives, but a specific obligation within that to do all that we can to prevent further violence. Because we know that domestic violence usually involves repeat victimization, we have a heightened responsibility to take action to prevent it. I think we need to take the domestic out of domestic violence. It's violence. It's just violence. Imagine we knew about repeated acts of violence being committed against someone. We knew that. Violence that unaddressed was likely to escalate, and we did nothing about it. That's just wrong. It's wrong as a society. I believe prevention and victim assistance are important components of a comprehensive response to domestic violence. But I also believe that if we have the ability to target chronically violent relationships and not only stop the violence from escalating, but maybe even stop it altogether, we should do that. We should do that. I kept thinking about the resources and the services and enforcement policies that came with the Violence Against Women Act, and I started to wonder if we had passed legislation called the Anti-Male Violence Act, I wonder if we would have thought more about how to actually stop the violence. David's idea struck me as an offender-focused strategy with victim safety as its highest priority. I also believe that domestic violence, if you really deconstruct it, domestic violence thrives on secrecy, even more than gun violence and open-air drug markets. By removing all of the secrecy that's involved in domestic violence encounters through a focused deterrence strategy with all the call-ins and the direct communication, we might even see more dramatic results than the other focused deterrence strategies. So I was there. And finally, the considerable research on David's focused deterrence work demonstrates quite clearly, and this is really important for those of us, and I include myself in this, who believe that our culture supports domestic violence. The research on focused deterrence shows you do not have to stop or fully address the root causes of open-air drug markets or gang violence in order to stop that behavior. So you don't need to wait till you address poverty and racism and inequality before you stop violence. You don't need to take everyone's guns away from them before you put a dent in guns violence. There are thousands of reasons to address poverty and racism and inequality, substance abuse. But we now know that you can save lives while we continue to solve those problems. And, really important, you don't need massive police presence, nor do you need to incarcerate great numbers of people. It's a targeted, focused approach that uses light enforcement touches to change behavior. I wanted to find out if we could control domestic violence as we now know how to control other kinds of crime, without increasing rates of incarceration and without first changing our culture so profoundly that reinforces violence against women. I felt that if we could keep victims' and advocates' fears in mind as we designed a strategy, ensure that there would be ongoing communication with victims, ensure that, and agree that if the strategy seemed to be doing more harm than good, we would stop immediately. We might actually save lives. If we could do all those things, we might save lives. And in my view, it was worth a trial. It was worth trying. And for all these years, it's been a great honor to be associated with this. They're on their own. They're doing a great job, and I really believe in it. That's how I wanted to start you off this morning. Take it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan.
You're welcome.
Shay, I feel like this cues you up. Sorry, hugging again. This cues you up really nicely because you also have been doing this work in Guilford County, in High Point, North Carolina for quite some time. You've worked with men, women, and children that have experienced violence. And you were doing this long before you all decided that you were going to take a different approach to tackling DV in your community. What was this like?
It was. I was like, finally. It made so much sense to me, I think. The first thing I want to say is what an honor it is for me to be here with these two ladies. They're rock stars in my field, so thank you for letting me sit on this panel with these guys. That said, I've been in the field for 13 years. To give you a little bit of context about the work that I do, we are a non-governmental, nonprofit agency. I have 2 shelters. I have 2 children's advocacy centers, 2 victim advocacy programs, a batter intervention program. I have about 52 employees in my division. So we serve the whole county of Guilford County. So this work is specifically in the municipality of High Point, North Carolina. So there are 2 other law enforcement agencies in the county. They do not do this work in the way that High Point does. So I have a very unique position to see what that looks like. So back to your original question, this made such sense to me in the beginning. Finally, somebody's going to hold him accountable. There's a couple of things that I want to say to lay the groundwork for all the other things that I will eventually ramble on about. Number one, domestic violence thrives in secrecy and in the dark. For someone to come forward and say, you know what, she may be scared of you, she may love you, but we do not. For law enforcement to say that in an open public forum, yep, and to lay that out there is powerful. In High Point, we specifically do it in City Hall. So the community is a part of that message, and they come out and say, you know what, we're not going to put up with this in our city. We're not going to allow this to happen in our city. So it's stripped away at that point. The community says, we know what you're doing. Law enforcement says, we know what you're doing. The victim advocacy agency says, we know what you're doing. And this is no longer about her strength and ability to carry this through, to hold you accountable. It's about the community's ability to do that. So, that said, now, your amen threw me off. Thank you. So that said, to have the community involved in that. So we want to talk about a culture change. I think that's the next place I want to take this, is to say to a community, we're no longer going to think that it's a private matter, and to have the conversation with judges, the district attorney's office, law enforcement, victim advocacy agency, all those things. And it's so interesting around victim advocates of how some inherent biases that we may have and how we think about things, just as Susan was saying. So there was a lot of folks around me, including my own colleagues, that kind of said, are you sure you're going to put your name on this? And I said, I am very sure I'm going to put my name on this. It made perfect sense to me, because instead of saying, why is she not leaving? Why are we not saying, why is he doing this? He's the reason why we're here, not her. So, all of those things to me just made inherent, perfectly good sense. And I too agree with Susan in the sense that I felt like what we're doing now is not working, folks. So that was a really good reason to take a step to a change. We've been doing this all these years. I don't even know the number of victims that I've stood in front of and safety planned and talked to and supported and, found resources for, with sort of this idea that it was her problem, mm-hmm, and not the community's problem, in the context of his behavior is why we're here. Mm-hmm. So to have the opportunity to look at law enforcement and know that they're going to respond consistently. I know what they're going to do. I know what that's going to look like. I can communicate that with her. I can talk about that in a very concrete, tangible plan. My advocates are very aware. They can talk to the detective, and with confidentiality releases signed, they can engage in a partnership with this detective to walk through that process. Now that law enforcement at this point is a service provider instead of a law enforcement component. So to be able to change that aspect for the victim, to look at law enforcement as somebody that's going to support her, that's going to do what they're supposed to do, that's going to engage in a conversation about her safety, that is going to engage in a productive conversation about the real things that she can do. And it's not all about, and I'm not talking about do in terms of engaging in the system, but do in the sense of, here are legitimate resources she can take advantage of, and law enforcement can be a piece of that. And I think that was one of the biggest lessons that I learned around, and I've always partnered with law enforcement. I've always had a really good relationship with our local law enforcement officers. We are very, very lucky in the county we live in. Our local law enforcements are all amazing to work with. So I've always partnered with them. It makes sense to me. So to take this partnership to a whole other level, it was amazing to me. We didn't even know what we didn't know, mm-hmm, around that partnership. So for us to find that out together, and honestly, from the victim advocacy side, and Chief, I think you're still in here, I'm not sure they knew what they wanted from victim advocates. I'm not sure they knew what they didn't know either. So that was a great exploration around our ability to find our feet in this project and to be able to know what we can do and not do. And the multiple conversations we've had about confidentiality and all those things, and to being able to navigate that. It's been tough, and sometimes the confidentiality is a little prohibitive to partnership, but I think we've been able to navigate that. So back to the original question around how has this changed, I think it's opened up a whole new world of understanding how to support a victim that has a lot to do with healing and all those things. And the other thing that I want to add to this is we approach victim services, my division, as long as I'm the director, we approach this as advocacy. We don't even consider whether she's going to leave or not. We just provide the service. We are going, if she wants to leave, we will find a way for her to do that safely, but we don't even really engage in that conversation as much as we say, here are the services. We do that without judgment, so it is not a conversation about her leaving, and I want to make sure everybody's clear on that. She doesn't need to leave. He needs to stop. And more than likely, she loves him. She has kids with him. She has a ton of reasons to remain in that relationship, and it's okay. His violence needs to stop. So that is our advocacy. We do a lot of safety planning and things like that, but I want to make sure that I also laid that groundwork that the advocacy is around we're going to assume she's going to remain in the relationship. So I'm going to stop there.
Yep.
I could go on for days.
Yep. I've heard it.
I'm kidding.
and
you did.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shay. Good job. We're going to get back to you in a second. We're going to go to Sandy. Sandy, I know that you were not, part of the original dream team, but you heard about this.
Thanks for letting me play.
You got a good record. You heard about this from across the country, and before you were even involved, sort of hands-on in working on this intervention, it had caught your attention. What were you doing, and why were you paying attention to this?
It's my job. No. For those of you who don't know me, let me just fill you in a little bit of my background, because I think it will necessarily explain at least that part of the question. I have been doing intimate partner violence work in some way or another since high school, and did college, went through law school. I have had stints with state coalitions doing policy work. I've worked in legal aid, helping victims get protection orders, helping them with custody orders. Talk about under-resourced. I also served as a prosecutor for almost 10 years, and I was lucky enough to land in an office that had a division for addressing intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. That division was me, and just me, but that's okay. I got to make up all the rules, so that was lovely. And then since then, I have been on board with the Battered Women's Justice Project, where I focus exclusively on the criminal justice response to intimate partner violence. And so to hear about innovations that are happening across the country, new ways, different ways that law enforcement and prosecutors, more importantly to me, because that's what I was, are joining forces, if you will, with advocates in a true partnership to make efforts to address these issues in ways that really do focus on victim safety. It's something that always falls on our radar. And so that's how we came to hear about it. In fact, one of our major funders, the Office on Violence Against Women, asked us to go to High Point and spend a couple of days learning about the High Point work. That's when I got to meet everybody, finally. But also, because we all know that every model, every pilot, has things that can be different, things that can be improved. And so we also went there with that eye as well, to try to make suggestions for things that either they had not addressed because that was their community choice, or things that hadn't been on their own radar to look at, so that when we got to this point now where we have the initiative and the possibility of replicating this work in pilot sites across the country, we can continue to evolve and continue to think about more creative ways to enhance and improve this initiative, again, in ways that keep that victim safety at the center of our work.
And this is for any and all of you. There are a lot of buzzwords in our community of work. One of them is victim-centered. If someone said to you, this is victim-centered, what would your response be?
Can I go to that base just a little bit on the history of what I've done? And this, I think this ties with some of the things that Shay was saying about the focus of their advocacy. Historically, I think we would all agree, law enforcement, prosecutors, whatever we call the larger criminal justice system, has looked at victims only in a way of how they help or hinder us in doing our job. If they were going to help us, great, we loved them, they were wonderful, they were the good victims. If they weren't going to work with us, if they were going to be uncooperative, if they weren't going to return our phone calls, then we just frankly didn't really care either. And so that has been the struggle, is how to get a criminal justice system that only saw itself existing to impose itself on victims rather than providing them help and services. And as Shay said, the only real solutions that the criminal justice system offered was conviction, which was a small measure, a small window of safety if you actually got any jail time for him, and separation. Only a real victim would separate and leave the abuser. And so it, again, became a definition of how we're going to help. And so from a response, investigation, prosecution point of view, sort of the evolution that we saw was the victim was an absolute requirement at the beginning. When the cops respond to the scene and they do their investigation, take their report, well, ma'am, do you want to press charges? Of course, he's standing right here while they're asking me that. And if I said no, then that was it. No case, no charge, nothing done. Nothing done to effectively interrupt the violence, to effectively give me a short window of time to get out of a crisis, to think clearly about my risks, my dangers, my needs, and certainly no long-term intervention at all. Then we started getting a little creative, at least on the prosecution side of things, and we sort of figured out, you know what, we can do this without her, okay? We figured out that all of those nice evidentiary rules, everybody knows, like hearsay, right? All those things about excited utterance, the things you say in the heat of the moment. Well, we can have the cops come in and testify what she told them when they rolled up on the scene. We can have the nurse at the emergency room come in and testify about what she told them while she was getting her stitches in. We liked it. We called it witness light, hearsay heavy. We liked that, but it also let us as cops and prosecutors off the hook. We didn't need her. So we had no obligation to provide her with anything. We had no obligation to engage with a victim, to learn about their life risks, to learn about the risks that we as a system present when they're suddenly thrown in to the whole gigantic mess that this system is. Then, of course, we all had Justice Scalia. My friend, no. He, in one opinion, keep in mind it was a 400-page opinion, in one case, completely threw what we thought was his very successful idea of victimless or evidence-based prosecution out the window. Now we needed her again, right? She had to be there in order for us to prove up the elements of the charge or to help us prove what we call forfeiture by wrongdoing, that he's been so bad and influenced her and kept her away from testifying so that we do get to use that hearsay. So now we're back where we started. But my argument and what I see IPVI being able to present in this context is the opportunity to go back to a situation where, yes, we need her, but to make sure that she's getting something valuable from us. that we as law enforcement and prosecutors are resources for her, that the victims aren't there just to fit in as puzzle pieces to our system and what we need to do on any given day. And so we need to, as prosecutors, and as I think has been talked about elsewhere here with our law enforcement responses, we need to be more humanistic about what we do and realize that this is one piece of the life of a victim, and it's, I guarantee you, it's nobody's best moment. They have so much more in their life, but most of it, we have to acknowledge, are the challenges they face. Obviously, they face very real challenges from the offender, very real physical, emotional, sexual violence challenges from that. They also have their own life risks. Do they have children? Will they always have to be in some contact with the offender because of the children? Oh my goodness, our Child Protective Service is involved in the good and bad that can come with that. Now that she's in part of the criminal justice system, who's going to be reporting about her to whom and what are going to be the consequences? And so now we need to be able to provide her resources too, so that we remain an open door, that it's not just this vast system out there, but that we are responsive on an individual level. And I do think that IPVI gives us another doorway into doing that. You want to stay with this, or you want to move on to something else? that was a long one. It's up to you.
If you have something to add, we'd love to hear it.
I mean, I think for law enforcement generally, for police and prosecutors, victim-centered is a hard concept because law enforcement all across the board, all the way up, everybody's trained to think about the needs and justice for society at large. I think police, I agree with everything you said except the conclusion. Sure. I think police and prosecutors need to be victim-informed. I think they need to communicate. I think they need to work well with. They need to be victim-sensitive. They need to serve victims. I agree with all of that. But I think it's complicated when you should be getting to a larger purpose often, which is the needs of society at large, to say, police, you're going to have a victim-centered approach, or prosecutors, you're going to be purely victim-centered. I think justice is about society as a whole. That's why I bought into this, because I think it says society has a responsibility and an interest, not just a responsibility. So I want everybody to do everything that you want them to do, but I don't want to call this a victim. This is a offender-focused strategy that's about victim safety, and victim safety is at the center of it.
The victim service lens, one of the things from my point of view, from a victim advocate, what we tended to do with, and I own this completely because I did it, decided what a victim needed.
Yeah.
And so, to be able to let her drive that and empower her to make those choices about what she needs, and whether it be prosecution or some other part of the system that she chooses to or not to participate in, that's my role, is to facilitate that as a victim advocate, not to determine what she needs, and not to decide that, she needs counseling. Those are all very, I kind of see it as sort of this parental role or the drill sergeant role, or I don't know, whatever role you want to label that, where we decide what folks need, when in reality it's a huge opportunity to empower them and for them to decide. They're the experts in them. We're not. And so for them to be able to give us what they need and for us to facilitate that for them.
I'd like to just add one point, jumping off on what Shay said. At the NYPD, we've just started a program. We're about halfway through a program where we're putting victim advocates, 2 victim advocates in every precinct around the city, every single one. And one is a domestic violence specialist and the other is for victims of any other kind of crime. We made an intentional decision not to do what most police departments and prosecutors do around the country, which is hire their own people and make them victim advocates. We brought in and we contract with a separate victim service agency, Safe Horizon, because their work is victim-centered. And anybody who is a victim service provider should provide victim-centered work. And we wanted victims to get the benefit of that work. So I think you have to figure out, and it's okay to say, sometimes victim-centered is right, and sometimes we're about society at large, but we're informed and really work well with victims.
And I know that, Susan, you touched on this in the beginning, and I think it's come up throughout, that this is an approach that's not looking at offenders as this monolith, right? That is taking into consideration the fact that there is actually an opportunity to prevent and to deter, and that not everyone, right, is going to be deterred. And in those instances, absolutely, we talk about criminal justice being tough medicine. We arrest, we prosecute, we incarcerate, we incapacitate, right? And that is in some ways a nuanced view of how to approach someone who is being violent towards their partner, when, as we've talked about, traditionally it was separate, end the relationship, regardless of what the victim wants, right? So how do we have a nuanced conversation around victim safety and offender accountability that can recognize, right, the needs of both of those individuals, both of those players?
Go ahead.
So specifically in this particular initiative, there are 4 levels. And I don't want to get too bogged down in this conversation, but I do think it's important to note that this is very concrete, because I think it's important for the victim to have this knowledge too. So I'll start at the beginning, which is a good place to start. Those are folks that, it's the D level. Those are the guys that you go out, probably nothing illegal happened, but you kind of know up here and in here that there's some DV stuff going on. Police, law enforcement responded. And so that is our area of prevention. So law enforcement alerts the victim advocates of those victims. So that is an area where we can really start to get that education out there in a prevention sort of way, to say, hey, you know, this is a red flag for us. This is a behavior that kind of points to some things that could be on your horizon, and we want to let you know about that. We want to talk about things that are concerning us. That is an area where we can really build some foundational education for the folks that come to us in that way. So the C level, those are the guys that have been arrested and they are in jail. And so one of the DV detective, which, by the way, to add some context to this too, we are co-located with the DV detective and legal aid. So we're all just a big happy family in that way.
Here comes Kumbaya.
Really, really. So we all are together in the same building. So that DV detective goes out to the jail and notifies him and says, you know, we know about this. By the way, at the D level, they receive a letter, and that basically says, we know what you're doing. You know, we're letting you know. We know. And so that letter goes, and there's one that goes to the offender and the victim. So at the C level, same thing, he's going to go and personally notify him in the jail. A letter also goes to the victim. It's referred to the victim advocates. We make contact. And we do all of the same services at every level, whether it's the D level where nothing really violent has happened yet, all the way up to the high lethality cases. So then we get up to the B level, and those guys you're getting into some pretty bad stuff at B level. And you can enter into these levels at any point with one offense. Does that make sense when I say that? Okay. So you can just skip to the top of the class depending on your level of offense. So that B level is you're starting to get into some bad things, and A level is just bad, not good stuff in that. And those are the areas where we're looking at lethality, and we're looking at fatality and those kinds of things. So we provide all those services at every level, and so it is a nuanced approach, as she was saying. So there's some level with guys that are starting to get their business on in the entry-level domestic violence. You know, it is a good opportunity for them to have that deterrence message right out of that way, and for her too, for her to understand this is not okay. That's what she's talking about with the levels and the nuanced approach to this.
Well, and just to add to that, is there there's an offer of help that's made.
Absolutely, thank you. So when at this level, at all those levels, there's offers for help. We want you to be a productive member of this community. We want you to join the rest of us in nonviolence. And there's a moral voice in High Point. It's called High Point Communities Against Violence. And those folks offer those services and supportive services for the offender to engage in, to take, to lead a productive life and a nonviolent life. So that is a huge part of it too. We love you. We want you to be a part of this community, but we're not going to put up with your stuff. You're not going to do that here.
Can I just say an interesting, for those of you who are very familiar with Ceasefire, this is the same group that is the moral voice in Ceasefire. So it is a group. There's no reason why it needs to be another group. It can be, but it doesn't need to be. It's the same people talking about how this community is not going to tolerate violence. So pretty powerful to not just have people who only talk about family, domestic, IPV. It's not that, I am one of them, but pretty powerful to have people who talk about violence. And this community is not going to tolerate any kind of violence, whether it's in the street, in the home, in the school, at your workplace. And we'll offer help to everybody. And in some cases in this project, it has to be a more specific kind of help, as well as jobs and substance abuse counseling, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same stuff. I need a GED. I need this, right? So think about how cool it is to be looking at Ceasefire, looking at what it's all about in its essence, and saying, what's the crime that we should be tackling next? And that's how High Point got to this. They did so well with gun violence and gangs. They did so well with open-air drug market. They looked at their stats and they said, what's next? Why don't we apply this to domestic violence? David had been talking about it, but High Point came to David and said, we have your methodology. It's now what we do. Why don't we do it with domestic violence? So you can't do it really well if you don't bring on people who are in the field and people who are talking about it, and that's what this discussion is. But think from a law enforcement perspective, if you've got a proven methodology, why not? Why not take it where your crime is?
And if I could, I kind of equate this a larger initiative, both what started in what High Point piloted for us and then what we hope to see elsewhere, is the difference between using a shovel and a scalpel. I think we can all agree that to excise something dangerous, we would rather use a scalpel and save what is good, right? Well, the criminal justice system is traditionally a great big shovel. But by using an initiative like this, where we recognize the differences and the distinctions in offenders, where we are playing a primary role in recognizing, addressing, and connecting to resources, victims, and their safety, we are able to target our shovel-like resources in a much more effective way, especially in a time of limited resources. Jail, prison is not the answer for every situation. But that's what we in the criminal justice system knew, and that's what we felt should be applied in every case. This gives us so much more information about the offenders and the victim, and it really institutionalizes a way to make that violence further visible to all of the other players and practitioners down the pathway so that it informs our decisions. It's not just enough for me as a prosecutor to get a conviction if it's only going to further jeopardize her, not necessarily her safety in regards to him, but her life and her life challenges. Is he losing a job? Is he the only breadwinner? Okay, what other consequences might be more appropriate and still keep her and her children safe? And this gives us the information, the way to formalize the collection of that information so that it can be used throughout the system by all of the practitioners, so that we are approaching each case individually and then I would argue more effectively.
And I think just one more from me before we go to the audience. We're talking about impact on communities, and we often think about this in terms of statistics, right? And we know that not all crime generally gets reported to the police, that there are a lot of fears around engaging with the police. And talking specifically about intimate partner violence, around half of all incidents are reported to police. And so you, in thinking about, right, how do we take something like this and apply it, you have to figure out what's going on in your community, understand the offending. And I know in High Point, right, you did a lot of research, looked back, and you saw, before this intervention, before you started implementing in 2009, there had been, 17 homicides between 2004 and 2009, right? And in the 8 years since implementation, to date, there have been 5. Now, of course, we don't want there to be any, right? But that's a huge decrease. And we know that we like to think about, okay, we want fewer homicides, but what do we also look at, right? What are some of the things we're looking at? We're also looking at things like reoffending, and we've been talking about, deterrence and stopping behavior. And I know that in High Point, right, they have a 5-year recidivism rate of less than 18%, right? So my question is, how does that compare? How does this compare to what we're seeing across the country, right? And what does this potentially tell us about how we can reduce homicides and how we can see lower recidivism rates?
I'll answer the second one first. It tells us it's working. That's what it tells us. Something about this is working. And that's why we want to have the future pilot sites, so that we can continue to replicate it and make sure that it is a truly effective response. Recidivism in intimate partner violence is notoriously high. It's also notoriously difficult to measure. The studies, because their methodologies vary and what they look at as far as timelines, how far between offenses counts as reoffending, what counts as reoffending. So you'll see statistics all over the board on this. But by and large, recidivism rates vary between, again, depending on which study you're looking at, 40 to 80%. We know that this group of offenders is one of the most difficult to keep from reoffending. And so to have, over that period of time, a recidivism rate that low shows promise. And what we want to make sure of is that that recidivism rate is that low because nothing is happening. We want to make sure that it's because he has made the rational choice to change his behavior, not that there's something going on that we don't know about, not that it's falling in that other category of not calling law enforcement for help. And that's, again, what we hope the future pilot sites will further refine for us with the evaluation. But just to not only have that dramatic drop in homicides, but to also then have such a decrease compared to other places across the country in reoffending is pretty phenomenal. And again, you have to raise your eyebrows and say something's working.
I think I would like to add to that, and this is, I will steal from Jim Summey, who's the executive director of the High Point Communities Against Violence. One of the things he always asks is, how do you measure something that didn't happen? So, for me, when I look at it through a victim advocacy lens, our homicide rate has dropped, but we really don't know how many lives we have saved by this intervention. And so we can't really measure something that didn't happen, thank God. And so there's that piece. And just the idea that the recidivism rate is quite measurable, so you can keep good stats on that and move that along. This initiative is not a magic bullet, and it certainly can't address things we don't know about. So if folks aren't calling, and here's the other part of this that I'm almost certain we'll get a question about this, so I'll answer it now. She's already not calling because of the system. So when we talk about her not responding or not reaching out for law enforcement help, criminal justice system, she's already not calling. And so that's not a reason not to take a look at this and say what we're doing now isn't working. So, and before, if she reaches out, pre-initiative, if you reach out, the system's not going to support you anyway, so why would I call? But at least at this point, if we can change the culture just a little to know that the system may engage, the chances of her calling may increase. So that culture change in the community to say the system's going to respond consistently, to me, is slow. It's a slow change, but nonetheless a change. I'll take that. Those are good numbers for me.
Mm-hmm. I just want to underscore that I said people don't call for lots of reasons. I named a lot of them. I want to add what Shay just said. If you're calling the police and you don't get relief, or the prosecutor treats you badly or drops your case because they don't think you have enough evidence, even if you want to proceed, or you didn't show up for 24 hours and so they drop the case, or the judge says go back, why should you keep calling?
Why should you?
It's not just that it's an abusive, racist system, which is the answer that, is one of the answers on the list. It's also that it doesn't help me. So why should I keep calling? It's not even you didn't help me, you didn't help my neighbor when she called, and I heard about her experience.
Absolutely.
So why should I go through that? So if we can't bring people relief, if we can't keep them safe, why should they trust us? And if we can't help them rebuild their lives, why should they trust us? We have to be better.
But, do you want me to grab a mic for you? Yes, absolutely.
Define entertain. No, I'm
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Robert Thornton. I'm with the Skillman Foundation in Detroit, Michigan. Been working with nonprofit sector for 40 years, and I am a staunch advocate for addressing domestic violence of any type, or any kind of violence, particularly violence against women. There's a reason for that. The philosophy shaped by the experiences. I have 6 sisters and a mother and 2 wives.
Sir.
It cannot be tolerated. First of all, I want to thank you for this wonderful work, this ministry that you do, and that's what it is. And it's very difficult work, and particularly the model that you have put together, working with comprehensive partners, and how you have taken your ceasefire platform to another level to address this. I think that is very important. As I sat and I listened to you, I thought you were talking primarily about people who are living in the same household, so girlfriend, husbands, wives, husbands, girlfriends, but they're living in the same households. In urban environments like ours, there's an ever-increasing population of young women in high school and junior high school who are experiencing horrific situations with this kind of thing. And I'm just asking if your model has an avenue for addressing some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes and no. I know the High Point Police Department loves it when I'm like, hey, I've got this new thing. Let's do this. Yeah, they're like, oh, goody, Shay's here. But that's okay. That's okay. They are super supportive of this and entertain me in that way. But one of the things that I've recently said is what you just said. Part of the problem is consent in the state around receiving services. So that's a piece of it to me that is really prohibitive, and not having a supportive parent that thinks that they can support DV as a normal thing in their home. So, the mom or the parent, the guardian, doesn't see the violence in the way, and I know what you're talking about. So those are 2 big barriers that we're trying to figure out how to address. One of the ways we're trying to get around that is to utilize our school resource officers into making those a partner in the conversation about teenage violence in that way, whether it be sexual violence or domestic violence or both. Utilizing those SROs to meet folks where they are in the school and to give the person a voice to say, I'm scared, I'm troubled. And in North Carolina, if you're under 18, you cannot get a domestic violence protective order. So that's another barrier that makes it hard for that person to actually find their own safety as opposed to relying on a parent or guardian to get them to safety. I could talk about this for days.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those
Just
are
say yes, we agree.
Yes. So yeah, those are things that we're kind of trying to navigate to figure out how we can find a back door to some of that stuff. We are working with the schools to get some education out there. That's basically what we've tried to do, to get some pamphlets, information, education in folks' hands. And I think with our culture, violence is so normal, people don't realize him shoving you sort of a gateway into these other things. And, you know, I did not grow up in a family of violence, so my view on respect looks very different than someone else's tolerance for violence, from the very simple of he pushed me all the way over to a fatality. So that tolerance of violence for me is very different, and it's on a different spectrum for a lot of folks. But those are some of the things that we're looking at trying to navigate, and I would think that in most communities that would be something to take a look at too. But the SROs, which are with High Point Police Department and High Point specifically, we're trying to kind of figure out how we can utilize them in that conversation to keep them safe at school, to have access, and those kinds of things. So did that answer your question?
Well, and just to point out, too, another sort of institutional obstacle, and I shouldn't say a sort of, it's a very big institutional obstacle, is the definitions. What we're talking about is adult court, and by that definition, the offender has to be an adult. But if we're talking about two juveniles, the statutes don't permit us, to intervene from an adult court level. And at least in my experience, the juvenile justice system has been at best ineffective and at worst punitive to both when you are brought into their system that way. But I appreciate the recognition of it, because it does that thing that Rachel doesn't like from me, which is, Rachel, I know where we're going next. We're going to start going into the juvenile justice system.
So we're actually going to go to one more question.
Oh. Okay.
I want to pick up on something that Susan Herman said, and call it away. It seems to me that the title of the panel falls short. So it talks about victim safety and offender accountability. Those are two excellent things. What it doesn't mention is that there's a very small probability that this guy in this domestic violence relationship is the next terrorist bomber or mass shooter. Yes. There's an overwhelming probability that the next terrorist bomber or mass shooter has done some of this stuff. And it's painful to spend your entire life preventing stuff that's not going to happen anyway. But the question of how to cull these cases for potential really bad outcomes, and I would suggest focusing a lot on whether the guy has a gun and whether whatever the legal process results in will keep him from having a gun. That seems to me something that goes beyond just protecting the victim.
Well, and that's already one thing that we've talked about. High Point has defined their levels of offending and how an offender gets categorized, based on their criminal justice involvement. There are communities across the country that are doing very specific risk assessment work with different models that have been peer evaluated and all of that good stuff you researchers like to hear. But we think that that's another enhancement that we could bring to this model, that it's not just being arrested or having a conviction for violating a protection order that gets you on a certain part of this distinction in levels, but it could also be just information, even if there's no arrest in a case. The officer is talking with the victim and learning this information, that he has lots of guns, that he's recently unemployed, that yes, he lives here, but this is not his child. All of those traditional factors that we know of indicate higher risk would be another way to put that offender on a certain level. And more importantly, I think it also helps inform us as practitioners in working with victims, so that not only do officers know some of the dangers that she faces when they go out the next time or see her for another reason, but I as a prosecutor know, and I can take steps to inform the court of that, so that if there are going to be any consequences in the criminal justice system, they're appropriate to the information that we know about him.
Our advocates do pretty good lethality screening, if that's what you want to call it, some of those red flag behaviors. And if we have any reason to believe that, and we had a case very recently that worried us, made us worry, we would pass that information on the best way we could. Try to make sure that, if they need to know something. We do a lot of screening with the victim because for lots of reasons, but some of those things with the terrorist stuff and the lethality around that, we really do try to pass that on to law enforcement if we have that information, because it's something that it weighs on our minds too of, what are you preventing? You have access to this information, not to profile folks, but to have an honest conversation about, hey, this is what this guy's capable of, and to make sure that the right folks know about that.
So I think, Mark, what you're pointing to is for years we've had lethality assessments of the victim which lead to better safety planning. For years we've talked about, given her situation, how would we advise her? And what you're getting at is pushing law enforcement to say, if you know he has a gun, what do you do? We've all gotten better at getting that licensed gun. You pull the license, you go get it. She's just told you he has access to a gun. Are you getting that search warrant? Are you going to get it? She just told you he has access to a knife that's a legal knife. What are you going to do about it? She's just told you that she's been strangled, which we're used to dealing with victims and saying, hi, marker, here's your level of danger has gone up. What is it that law enforcement does? Do they have the equipment to look at that, to see that she has been strangled, even when they can't see the bruises? Do they have the alternate light source technology? All of that stuff is, there has to be not only great safety planning on the part of victim advocates and victim services, there's a new and added emphasis on what is the role of law enforcement. It's way beyond catch, prosecute, incarcerate. It's way beyond. There's a big power of or else, and there's a lot of alternatives in between prosecution and incarceration. So I think that in this field, as well as everything else we've been talking about over the last 2 days, law enforcement has to rise to the challenge and figure out new policies and procedures. This is a good strategy for IPV. There's no question about it. But we ought to be thinking generally about affirmative, focused, creative, strategic ways to intervene to stop violence.
And that's time. I want to thank our panelists so much for being here today. Thank you all for joining us.